kiddos. So let's talk about Indiana some more. So now that we've had all of these immigrants coming in and all of these things happening, we're looking towards kind of the end of the 1800s. And a new area really starts getting developed. So in the beginning, not very many people lived up where we were, especially in the northeast corner, and definitely around Lake Michigan. There it just really wasn't getting used at all. It was really swampy and had a lot of marshlands, and people just were not at all interested. But within about 20 years, that really started to change. We started having a lot of areas that wanted to move in there. It was known as the Calumet region. Because the Grand Calumet River ran through the area, so they just named it after the river. The thing is that the land was really, really cheap, and so these industries that were coming in and building factories were like, sweet, I can go up there, get land ridiculously cheap, build my giant factory, and have lots of success because I won't be in a lot of debt. I won't have a lot of money I need to make to pay off this land. It was also really good transportation wise because there was the river, there were roads, there were railroads that all went through that area, so it was easy to get to. And so the first industry that was there was the oil industry. We talked a little bit about the oil refinery that was built in Whiting, but then the steel industry followed pretty quickly after. So Indiana Steel built the first steel mill in East Chicago, Indiana in 1901. And then a lot of men and women came up to work in the Calumet factories. Some started out as farmers, but we talked about how the price of farm food was really dropping, and so a lot of them ended up being forced to sell their land, and they began working in the factories. We also had a lot of immigrant laborers who were working in those factories as well. So talking about Gary, we talked about their school system and how much it boomed. And part of the reason for that was because it very quickly became one of the largest cities in the Calumet area. Originally, when people started living there, it wasn't even a city. It was just land. It had no name. But then a chairman from the U.S. steel industry ended up naming the city. The city ended up being named after him, and his name was Albert S. Gary. So hence Gary, Indiana. So in 1906, the U.S. Steel Corporation that this Gary guy was a chairman of bought 9,000 acres of land. It's a huge amount of land. And it was a corporation, so it was a whole company that was designed just for the purpose of creating steel. And so it built the largest steelworks in Indiana. It was much better than inland steels that had been built at East Chicago. Let's see. So what happened is they built this giant factory, and then they also started building the city so that people that were working there would have places to live and things to do, and they really liked that. The whole thing had 47 furnaces for melting steel, which is crazy. And so they had all these homes built so that the U.S. steel workers could live there. And so people started flooding into northern Indiana because not only could they get a job, but there were new houses to live in. So by 1910, they had 17,000 people living there already. So it's a lot of people in a very short amount of time. So the U.S. Steel Company did a lot in that area. They had social events, they did educational programs, and so they were really trying to make it a great place to live. They offered programs that would teach immigrants English and would help the immigrants convert to American life, and so they were really kind of doing a lot in that area. So in the next decade, the city tripled in size. I mean, people just kept coming. They got a lot of immigrants from England and Ireland and Italy and Germany and Greece and Poland and Russia and all those areas we've been talking about. And by 1920, we had 55,000 people living in the city. In the 1920s, we also started having African Americans moving to Gary from the southern states. And during that same time period, we also were encouraging people from Mexico to immigrate in to take these jobs as well. So by 1930, we had over 100,000 people in Gary, Indiana. And so we had, let's see, I would say about half of the population by 1930 was made up of immigrants and then their children that had been born in America. And then about 1 in 5 of the people living in Gary were African American. But per usual, the African Americans were not treated fairly. They had separate housing, they had separate schools, they were often given the houses that were in the worst part of the city. So it wasn't fair per usual. So then it was pretty much all men that worked there. But then when World War II happened, U.S. Steel did start employing some women to make up for the men that had to leave their jobs to go to the war. So we also had another industry that started booming at this time, and this was the automobile industry. At this point, we had only had attempts at vehicles. There was nothing that was hugely successful. But in July 4th of 1894, Elwood Haynes in Indiana worked on building a gasoline-powered automobile. He was in kind of Kokomo area is where he kind of tested out this automobile to see if it would work on their roads. And it was amazing because guess what? The car went 7 miles per hour. I know. But back then that was a huge deal. And so they quickly ended up creating an automobile company. In 1898, they had produced 5 different handmade cars. And by 1916, they had already sold 7,000 of those cars. And they were in a factory in Kokomo. So that really took off. People started seeing these inventions. They started making their own designs. And so by the early 1900s, we had 375 automobile companies in 40 different cities in Indiana, which is a lot. Why did people want to come here? For the same reasons all the other industries did. We had a lot of land. It was really cheap. The transportation system was amazing, so people could get to Indiana easily from anywhere using rivers, railroads, roads, because we had been the crossroads of America, right? Everything came to us. And so those things really made people want to go for it. And so we ended up for a lot of years being like the top automobile people. We actually had a couple of cars that became famous around the world. But slowly but surely everybody started going bankrupt, because it's just a lot of money. And there was so much competition and not a lot of return going on. The company that actually remained in Indiana for the longest was the Studebaker Corporation that we have in South Bend. So the Studebaker Corporation was started by a couple of brothers, and some of you may know this if you've gone on field trips to Studebaker. But in the 1880s, it was one of the largest makers of the horse-drawn wagons, and then it started making electric cars in 1902. So by 1920s, it was the 5th largest automobile maker in the country. And it continued making cars until about 1963. Now we really have no Indiana-owned automobile companies left in our state, but we do still have a lot of auto places that are manufacturing and selling here. So it's still important, especially when we think about like mobile homes and motorhomes and campers and those things. We have a lot of that happening here. This was also around the time that sports started happening. So in 1908, Carl Fisher, who made auto parts, decided that he was going to build a racetrack in Indy. And the purpose of this racetrack was so that all these automobile makers could test out their cars. And so he called it the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. But it got nicknamed the Brickyard because he wanted the smoothest and safest path for these people to race on. And so they laid down... hold on, I know the numbers on here. They laid down more than 3 million bricks to pave this, and so it became known as the Brickyard. Most of the bricks are still there today, but a lot of it's covered with asphalt. In 1911, they started having a 500-mile race each year that became known as the Indy 500, and it became one of the world's most famous sporting events. 400,000 fans or more attend it each year to, see the race. Most of the drivers were all men. In 1977, we had the first female race car driver in the Indy 500. And then in 2005, Danica Patrick became the first female that ever led any of the laps. So she didn't necessarily win the race, but she was in the lead at points in the race. And that was the first time a female had done that. Less than 10 years after the Motor Speedway was made, we also had Bosfield in Evansville that was created, and it's one of the oldest professional ballparks in the entire country. It was actually a school board project, and it cost the city $65,000. In 1915, you could get a seat there to watch a baseball game for 25 cents. And in 1992, if you've seen the movie A League of Their Own, they actually filmed some of their things at Bosfield. So it seats more than 7,000 people, and nowadays the Evansville Otters play there. So we have all these industries, we have all this stuff going on, we have all these things happening. And so next thing we know, we've got all of these labor workers all over the place. And unfortunately, working in these factories kind of sucked. It was messy. It was dangerous. The hours were insane. I mean, we're talking 10 to 12-hour days, 6 days a week. Nowadays, people pretty much work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. So we're talking a lot more work, a lot more time away from families, for a lot less pay. Women and children earned a lot less than the men did, and African Americans were, again, often shortchanged as well. A lot of people got hurt while working at factories because it was really dangerous, and then if you got hurt, you couldn't work, and they wouldn't pay you while you couldn't work, even if it wasn't your fault that you got hurt. So we started having labor unions, which is basically a group of people that just wanted to fight for the rights of people that were working in these factories so that it would be fair. It was a great idea. The problem is we were not able to have the leverage we thought we were going to have. And so we had the first strike in 1877 for the railroad because the railroad people were like, we're going to pay you less. We're just don't feel like it. We're going to pay you less. And the railroad workers were like, no, so we're going on strike. And so the railroad was like, that's fine. There are more people out there that want jobs. So they just went and hired people that weren't part of the union to come work at the railroads. And so the union lost. And so then again in 1919 in Gary, another strike happened because the steel mills had their people working 12 hours a day and they wanted to work 8 hours a day. And the steel mill refused, so they went on strike. And again, the steel mill just went and found more people who wanted jobs and brought them in instead. And that one actually got pretty violent because the union people that were on strike actually were physically attacking and assaulting the new workers that came in. And the union ended up losing that too. And so these losses caused the union involvement and enrollment to really drop over the years, which was a bummer because the union was really just trying to do what was best for workers. We've had some political leaders come out of Indiana during this time. So in 1888, Benjamin Harrison was from Indy, and he was elected president. He opened Ellis Island in New York, and that was able to cause millions of immigrants to come through there for inspection. We had two Hoosiers that served as vice president. Charles W. Fairbanks served under President Theodore Roosevelt, and then we had Thomas R. Marshall, who was serving under President Woodrow Wilson. We've also had three others that were elected vice president, and we've had many other Hoosiers that were elected vice president but failed to win. Pence is vice president now from Indiana. So it's interesting because Indiana actually gets the nickname sometimes of being the mother of vice presidents. So yeah, I hope that helps.